everyone, welcome to the Lydia Naomi channel. In the last video, I made this dress out of a 3XL men's shirt. Also, I definitely channeled my inner Disney princess. I attempted to imitate Giselle's animal calling skills, but I actually failed. I picked clover and daisies and sang on a hill in the waning sunlight. And now we come to the promised dress style variation where we will make this gathered skirt dress from scratch. My pattern in my previous video is linked in the description. If you would rather make this pattern yourself or at least get an idea on how it was made, be sure to check out the previous video. So I chose a yarn dyed cotton gingham and used 3 yards. Because it was so thin, I cut double for the bodice so that it wouldn't be transparent. When you cut, make sure that you snip all of the notches. These play an integral role in folding and ironing and matching pattern pieces together. I prepped my bias binding by cutting strips diagonally or on the bias because the bias has a natural stretch to it, which allows us to sew the binding around curves. Take these strips and attach them together by layering them at a right angle to each other. Sew a diagonal stitch, then cut the seam allowance. Iron these seams open and flat, then feed the strip through a bias tape maker. Before we begin sewing, we want to prep our pieces so that it will be easier and more intuitive as we piece this garment together. So we're going to iron the hems and fuse and iron the buttoned area. You will also want to serge or zigzag your edges so that they don't unravel over time. Your fusing will fall inside the seam allowance and will be double the width of your fold back or facing width. There's a piece for this in the pattern and a guideline for where to iron it on. Next, you want to fold in the seam allowance, then fold at the finish fold notch. Refer to my previous video for how to create your button extension. When applying fusing, do not drag your iron over it. You should first hover the iron over your fusing to let the seam shrink it a little, and then press down and lift the iron between presses to apply the full surface of the fusing. For the skirt, we are doing the same to the front panels, but this time the hem allowance is 2 inches, so we're going to leave that area unfused. I do recommend that you iron the hem up first, then iron the buttoned area. It will have a much nicer finish. As you can see, I'm not doing this, but I ended up changing it later. Next, we will add the pockets, one to each side of the side seams. With your back panel facing up, line up the pockets at the top of either side. In my pattern, there are 2 pockets, one for the flared skirt and one for the straight gathered skirt. They are labeled so you won't have a problem in locating them. Sew these pockets at 3/8, so that will be 1/8 less than your seam allowance, and edge stitch. Next, layer the front and back together and sew 1 inch down from the top of the pocket and stop. Leave a 6-inch gap for the opening and sew a 1/2 inch above the bottom of the pocket to the hem. Next, sew your pocket together. To finish the skirt, sew a large double stitch line on each panel. Make sure you leave the pockets out of this. Then take your bodice patterns and gather your skirt to this width, tying off the ends when it's complete. Now we're moving on to the bodice. I have sewn my front dart and I am ironing it with my ham. Next, attach the front and back bodice at the shoulder seams. Now, I was trying an ungathered sleeve, just a plain normal sleeve, but I then changed it later. So at this point, you would want to sew a double layer of stitching to gather the head of your sleeve and apply it with your notches matching your bodice. A single notch for the front and double notch for the back. After this, sew up the side seams. Next, we are going to attach the bodice to our prepared skirt. Make sure that you pin seam to seam and do not sew the button extension together in their folded state. Unfold them and match the bodice and skirt, then sew. We will refold them again to sew them down later. Now I have sewn the waist seam and serged it, and I'm just ironing all of these seams. It would be much easier to iron the side seams of the bodice and skirt before they were attached. Ironing is just crucial to making your garments look more professional, so always iron as much as you can between sewing steps. Next, you want to sew your hem, then we are going to jump to finishing the neckline with bias binding. So we're opening up the bias binding and sewing along the neckline at 1/4 inch. I include a little bit of elastic along the shoulder since it's a wide set shoulder and can fall off more easily without this. We then understitch the bias tape. So I'm sewing the bias binding to the seam allowance very close to the edge. Then to finish, you fold over your front button extension and fold the bias tape down to do an edge stitch all the way around the neckline. Finally, I re-iron the button extension folds and edge stitch it in place. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed this in the past, but women's garments traditionally button with right over left. So the buttonholes are on the right and the buttons are on the left. This is how we're going to place the buttons on this dress. I'm using my button and buttonhole placement guide as included in the pattern to place my buttons and buttonholes on the finished garment. Now you will see here that I'm creating horizontal buttonholes. Don't do this, this was a complete mistake. I've adjusted this in the actual pattern so you won't have to figure it out for yourself. The reason you don't want to do this is because it's a lot harder to button your dress. And it's actually industry standard for tinier buttons to have a vertical buttonhole. So you can actually look at your own garments at home and see for yourself. Horizontal buttonholes are more often used for larger buttons. Vertical buttonholes are also a lot more forgiving, and you'll see why. I use my Domestic Machines button setting to create the holes, then I watched the final episodes of The Office for the first time while I sewed those many buttons onto the dress. But I finally finished, and here is the final product! If you make this dress, please do share it with me on Instagram because I would absolutely love to see it.